By the late 1940s, 17 million visitors a year were arriving on a stretch of Lancashire coast barely 7 miles long. 17 million to a beach on the cold Irish Sea, in a country with warmer coastlines within a day's travel. 17 million, more than came to almost any resort on the European continent in those same years. They came by train. They came by charabanc. They came in numbers that no seaside town in Britain, before or since, has matched. Today, a man born on that same 7 miles of coast can expect to live to 73 years and 8 months, the lowest male life expectancy anywhere in England, in a borough ranked, year after year, the most deprived local authority in the country. Between those two figures lies the history of an entire town built on a single wager, and what happened the year the wager stopped paying out. Chapter 1. The Blackpool. Before it was a resort, before it was anything at all, it was 7 miles of sand between two river mouths on the Fylde coast, and nothing stood on it worth naming. The coastline runs flat where the rest of England's shore rises into cliff and headland, and flat land does nothing to slow a wind coming straight off the Irish Sea. There was no harbour here, no navigable river, no reason for merchants to settle or ships to call. The soil was too wet for good farming and the exposure too raw for comfortable living, so the land stayed marsh, dune and grazing for a few sheep. There was only the sea, the wind and a dark stream running down to meet the tide. That stream gave the place its name. It rose inland through a bed of peat, and the peat stained the water black, and where the stream crossed the sands to meet the sea, it left a dark pool that fishermen had used as a landmark longer than anyone could say. They called it, in the plain manner of people who name what they see and nothing more, the Blackpool. Not a resort, not a destination. Not, for most of the 18th century, anything but a description of a stream and the handful of cottages gathered near it, fishing, keeping sheep, waiting out weather that arrived off open water without warning. Nobody came to the Blackpool who did not already live there. Then, in the middle of the century, an idea reached the Fylde that had nothing to do with fish or sheep. It came down from the spa towns of the interior, from Harrogate and Scarborough and Bath, where physicians had convinced a fashionable clientele that mineral water and cold immersion cured almost anything the body suffered. Someone noticed that the sea performed the same cure at greater volume and lower cost, and that a coastline too poor for farming might yet be rich enough for bathing. It needed no monastery, no manor, no guild in its way, only a stream, a pool, and cottages willing to become lodgings. By the 1750s, the first health seekers made the crossing on foot and horseback and found cold water, clean air and very little else. By 1781, the transformation had a shape a visitor could recognise. Hotels stood where cottages had stood, not many, not grand, built specifically to house people who had travelled specifically to enter cold water. A private road was cut through the marsh to carry them down from the turnpike to the shore, because before it existed, reaching the Blackpool meant crossing land that resisted every step. 20 years later, in 1801, the census counted the entire permanent population at 473 people holding a coastline on the strength of a medical fashion that owed nothing to soil, trade, or industry. No cathedral stood here to draw a pilgrim. No ruin, no ancient charter, no market town's inherited authority, no river deep enough for commerce, no mineral seam, no crop that grew better here than anywhere else in Lancashire. What Blackpool had, it had invented out of water and want. Walk the sands in those years and you would have found wind, a dark stream meeting the tide, and a short row of hotels standing with their backs to open marsh, waiting on a season that might or might not arrive. The town existed on the faith of its landlords, that people with no obligation to come would keep coming, year after year, for their health. It was a resort with no natural collateral behind it, no scenery worth painting, no history worth touring, nothing to sell but distance from home and proximity to the sea. That faith was, in 1801, still small enough to fit on one page of a ledger. It would not stay that size for long. The faith needed machinery before it could become an industry, and 60 miles away, in the counting houses of Preston, it was already being imagined by men who had never stood on the Blackpool sands. One of them was an attorney named Henry Banks, and by the 1830s he studied a map of Lancashire with a question the sheep farmers of the Fylde had never needed to ask: how fast a train might get there. Chapter 2. The man who sold the coast. The man who answers the wager is a lawyer. a world removed from fishermen and bathing house keepers. An attorney out of the filed countryside named Henry Banks, who in 1819 buys the Lane Ends estate, a stretch of dune and marsh grass running along the township's southern edge. He has spent a career reading documents that convert bare possession into income, and he now turns that instinct on sand. He does not build first. He waits, watching for 18 years the trickle of health seekers who arrive each August to bathe in water certain physicians insist can cure gout and consumption. And only in 1837 does he raise the town's first holiday cottages. On ground he alone controls. Then he does something more consequential than building. He starts selling the coast itself. Banks carves Lane Ends into building plots and offers them parcel by parcel to anyone with capital enough to raise a boarding house of his own. He sells the plot. He sells the frontage. He sells the expectation that a paying stranger will one day walk past the door. History will later call him the father of Blackpool, though the title flatters what was, in practice, closer to warehousing. He treated an unremarkable rind of coastline as inventory, marked for subdivision rather than preserved as scenery. A plot at Lane Ends in the 1830s could be had for something under £50. Not a fortune, but more than a filed farm labourer would clear in 2 years of wages. Each buyer was betting that Banks's arithmetic held, that visitors would keep arriving in numbers sufficient to fill rooms that did not yet exist. For a while, the bet is a modest one. It is modest because the town remains hard to reach. Blackpool grows from 473 residents in 1801 to something near 2,500 by mid-century, a resort of self-selecting, unhurried prosperity, its season rationed by the coach and the private carriage, and by roads that turn to standing water at the first hard rain. Only those with leisure enough to spare a week and money enough to spare the fare make the journey. Banks's plots fill slowly, at the pace such people arrive. Then, in 1846, a branch line is driven west from Poulton, 8 miles of track laid flat across reclaimed farmland, and the arithmetic that had governed the town for a generation stops applying. The coach had rationed Blackpool. The railway does not ration anything. Within the decade that follows, the character of the visitor turns over almost entirely. The season no longer belongs chiefly to the gouty and the well-off, but increasingly to clerks, shopkeepers and labourers who could not previously have justified the fare, let alone the days lost from a till or a bench. Landlords who had built for dozens now scramble to house hundreds. New terraces rise along streets Banks had surveyed years earlier and never filled, and still the trains outrun the builders. He had sold the coast on a wager that people would choose to come. The railway does not wait for anyone to choose. It delivers them, and 80 miles to the east, across the mill towns of Lancashire, a different clock has already started, counting down toward the 1 week each year when entire factories, looms silenced and chimneys cold, will empty their workers onto that same platform. Chapter 3. The Wakes Weeks. By the 1850s, the coastline no longer waited on chance visitors and passing invalids. It had found a permanent tenant, and the tenant was cotton. Lancashire's mill towns synchronised their calendars in a way no industry in England had synchronised before. Each town chose 1 week of the year by custom rather than statute, and shut its looms down entirely for that week alone. On that week, the chimneys stopped smoking, and the whole of the town's population went to the coast at once. Not a delegation, not a holiday party, the entire town. It emptied Oldham. It emptied Bolton. It emptied Burnley. The switch flipped again the following week for another mill town entirely, and again the week after that, so that the season became a relay of cold chimneys and full boarding houses running from early summer into autumn. No other English resort had ever built its calendar around an industrial shutdown. Blackpool, cheap, close, and already accustomed to crowds it hadn't built rooms for, took the whole of it. This was the decision that separated Blackpool from every other watering place on the map. Southport paved its promenades for the gentry and drafted ordinances to keep day trippers off its sands. Lytham, 8 miles south, cultivated its quiet villas and asked nothing of the cotton towns at all. Blackpool asked. It extended no charity to the working poor. It was a business, selling lodging, food and noise to the only market large enough to fill every bed it had built. The mill hand with a week's wages in his pocket and 7 days before the whistle called him back. That the wages were modest hardly mattered, since there were, in the end, hundreds of thousands of them, arriving together. Hoteliers underpriced their rooms and shortened their season to match the customer they had chosen. It worked for 100 years. The rhythm was absolute, almost liturgical. Through 51 weeks, the mill operatives saved toward the 52nd, often into a fund organised inside the factory itself, so that by the week of closure, the money already existed before the holiday did. Then, over 2 or 3 days, the operatives of those same towns boarded excursion trains timed to the hour, and Blackpool's population, 473 souls in 1801, was already growing towards something closer to 14,000 by 1881, swollen further still, week upon week, by tens of thousands who arrived and departed within 72 hours. Landladies met the trains at the station. Beds were let twice in a day to 2 different families. A year's discipline spent itself in a week. What this meant, though no one in the town said it plainly at the time, was that Blackpool had traded one uncertainty for another. It no longer depended on the recommendations of physicians or the leisure of a small, moneyed class. It depended now on Lancashire's mills staying open, on cotton staying profitable, on the Wakes Week surviving as custom rather than lapsing as one. The wager Henry Banks had first placed on an empty stretch of coastline had been renewed on new terms, and the terms were narrower than before. A resort built on the gentry could survive a poor season on reputation alone. A resort built on the operative survived only as long as the operative kept his job and his week. Bind a town's fortune to a single industry and you inherit that industry's calendar, its wages, and eventually its collapse. For now, in the 1850s and 1860s, that collapse was nowhere in sight. The mills were full and so was the coast, full and increasingly impatient. A week's freedom bought with 11 months of labour does not want passive scenery. It wants distraction dense enough to fill 16 waking hours regardless of what the weather off the Irish Sea decides to do. Blackpool had the crowds now. What it didn't yet have was anything close to enough to occupy them, and that shortage, visible on wet afternoons when thousands of mill hands stood under shop awnings with a week's wages and nowhere to spend it, was about to be answered in iron, glass and electric current. Chapter 4. Manufactured Daylight. In 1863, the town acquires its first permanent structure of iron over open water. The North Pier is designed by Eugenius Birch, the pier engineer whose ironwork by then already reached out from a dozen English resorts into a dozen different tides. It is built narrow and ornamental, a promenade rather than a stage, built for the better classes, for visitors who wanted the sea beneath their feet without the crowd's noise in their ears. 5 years later, in 1868, Central Pier opens 400 yards to the south, and it answers North Pier the way a factory floor answers a drawing room. Central Pier is built openly for the masses. Dancing platforms, open-air bands, a structure meant to be loud. 2 piers 5 years apart on the same half-mile of coast, built for 2 different Blackpools that would never fully agree to become one town. The seafront simply learns to hold both. None of it solves the town's oldest problem, which is the sky. A wet Tuesday in July still empties the promenade in an hour, and a wage earner from Oldham with 6 days of holiday and no return ticket until Saturday cannot be sent home by rain. The answer, opened on July 27, 1875, is the Winter Gardens, an indoor complex of ballrooms and assembly halls, no pier and no open-air platform this time, built specifically so that weather could no longer close the town. It could not stop the rain rolling in off the Irish Sea. It could not stop the wind that had driven bathers indoors since 1781. It could not lighten a grey sky over the felled coast in any month of the year. So it builds a roof instead, and under that roof the dancing continues regardless of what the Atlantic is doing outside. Blackpool has stopped negotiating with its climate. It has started building around it. Then, in 1879, it attacks the other half of the problem. Not the rain, but the dark. 8 arc lamps go up along the promenade that year, and Blackpool becomes one of the first towns anywhere on earth lit by electricity, years before London's streets or Manchester's mills are wired in any comparable way. The advertisements call it artificial sunshine, and the phrase is not exaggeration so much as engineering. A Lancashire coastal town has found a way to keep its promenade populated after the sun that governs every mill worker's one free week has already gone down. Crowds that once cleared out by dusk now stay through the evening, and the season itself begins to stretch past its old August boundary into September and beyond. What begins as 8 lamps on iron poles will, in time, grow into the Illuminations, a festival of light along this same stretch of coast that is still switched on every autumn, more than a century later, largely unchanged in purpose, if not in scale. 6 years after the lamps, on 29th September 1885, Blackpool opens the first electric street tramway in Britain, running the length of the seafront on rails laid where bathing machines once stood. It is sold to visitors not as transport but as an attraction in its own right, modernity itself boarded for a fare, the future rendered as a ride along a promenade that had been treeless moorland 80 years before. The tramway survives its own century intact. It is today the only first-generation electric street tramway still operating anywhere in the country. By 1885, then, the town that had no natural reason to exist has manufactured its own daylight, its own weatherproof interior, and its own machine for arriving. It has done in 30 years for pleasure roughly what Oldham and Bolton did for cloth, mechanised it, scaled it, put it on rails. One structure remains to be built before the skyline is complete. 500 feet of iron rising in 1894, over the promenade its builders designed it to crown. Chapter 5. 500 feet of iron. On the afternoon of the 14th of May, 1894, a crowd gathers on the promenade to watch the town do something no seaside resort in England has done before. Raise a monument. Not a pier, not a pavilion, not another glass-roofed hall for wet afternoons. A tower, 500 feet of riveted iron standing against the wind off the Irish Sea, built by the Lancashire architects James Maxwell and Charles Tuke at a cost of roughly £290,000. The figure matters. It is not the price of a pleasure garden or a dance floor. It is the price of permanence, paid by a town that 5 decades earlier was a scatter of bathing huts on a treeless coast. 5 years before, in Paris, Gustave Eiffel had raised his own tower for a World's Fair meant to dazzle nations. Blackpool, with no fair to justify it and no government behind it, builds its answer anyway. A working-class resort staring across the Channel at the capital of European engineering and declining to be outdone. The ambition is not subtle, and it is not meant to be. Lancashire's mill towns had spent a century learning to manufacture cotton faster, cheaper, and in greater volume than anywhere else on Earth. Blackpool, in turn, had spent 30 years learning to manufacture pleasure with the same discipline. The piers in 1863 and 1868, the winter gardens in 1875, the arc lamps of 1879, the tramway of 1885. The tower is the crown fitted onto that skyline, the single object that answers every question a visitor might ask about what kind of town this is. It is not a folly, it is a wager, cast in iron so that no gale off the Fylde coast and no downturn in the cotton trade could blow it over. Iron does not rot in salt air the way ambition rots in balance sheets. That was, perhaps, the point. Beneath the legs of the tower, in a ballroom sheathed in gilt and red plush, the town builds its second monument, quieter than the first but no less permanent in its effect on the people who pass through it. For decades, the resident organist there is Reginald Dixon, seated at a Wurlitzer console that rises through the floor on a hydraulic platform, playing waltzes and quick steps to couples who have come off the mills for Wakes Week and will be gone again in 7 days. Dixon does not merely accompany the dancing. He becomes, to a generation of Lancashire workers, indistinguishable from the town itself, his signature tune drifting out of wireless sets across the county until the sound of Blackpool is no longer a figure of speech, but a plain description of a man's daily labour. The ballroom fills, empties, fills again, season after season, while above it the iron holds its shape against the sea wind exactly as its architects intended. What the tower represents, standing there in 1894, is not spectacle, but stubbornness made vertical. Every plank of the Winter Garden's roof, every mile of tramway rail, every arc lamp bolted to the promenade had been a bet that pleasure could be engineered like cloth. The tower is that same bet run to its logical extreme, a structure built not for one summer or one decade, but to outlast the men who financed it, the visitors who climbed it, and very likely the industry that paid their wages to come. It will still be standing, unmoved, long after the mills that built Blackpool's fortune have gone quiet. For now, though, it is simply the tallest thing on the Fylde coast, visible from the trains bringing 30,000 mill hands into town for a single loud week. And behind its bright legs, along the stretch of promenade, the visitors are already calling the Golden Mile. A different, less respectable trade is beginning to set up its stalls. Chapter 6. The Golden Mile. Behind the electric hum of the tower's four legs, the promenade thins into a different economy. Here, along the stretch, the postcards call the Golden Mile. Canvas booths crowd the pavement three deep, each front painted brighter than its neighbour, each barker's voice pitched to cut through the next man's. Inside, a bearded woman, a tattooed man, a boy billed as born with the legs of a goat, a woman advertised as armless who threads a needle with her feet for tuppence a look. The crowd filing past these booths at 3 p.m. is the same crowd that fills the Tower Ballroom at 9 that night, in the same clothes, with the same coins. Blackpool does not distinguish between the dignified pleasure and the grotesque one. It prices them both at the door. In the summer of 1932, the newest attraction on the Golden Mile is a clergyman. Harold Davidson, the rector of Stiffkey, was defrocked by the Church of England the year before, convicted by a consistory court of immorality with women he insisted, to his death, he had only tried to save. Unfrocked and unemployed, he finds work the town understands. He is exhibited fasting inside a barrel on the seafront, roped off from paying spectators, a placard nailed beside the door listing the hours of his confinement. Visitors pay a few pence to watch a man not eat. He obliges. It is not humiliation he suffers there, but a trade he has learned to work, one barrel and one placard at a time, moving the act between Blackpool and the other resort towns as the season demands. 5 years pass. In 1937, in a Seaside show built along the same lines as the Golden Miles booths, a cage, an admission charge, an act billed as a test of nerve, Davidson enters an enclosure with a lion. The lion mauls him. He dies of his injuries 2 days later. The town that sold spectacle had never asked closely what the spectacle was. The local papers note it and turn to the week's tram receipts. 3 miles to the south, on dunes too poor for anything else, a different bet is placed at the same time. In 1896, two businessmen, William Bean and John Outhwaite, lease a stretch of sand at the town's southern edge and call it the Pleasure Beach. There is no barrel here, no cage, only mechanism, a switchback railway, a helter-skelter, rides built to make the stomach drop rather than the conscience. The wooden Big Dipper arrives in 1923, its twin timber tracks racing each other for 60 seconds at a time. The Grand National follows in 1935, and by the decade's end, the Pleasure Beach draws more paying visitors each year than any other attraction in the country. It is the Golden Mile's respectable twin rather than its substitute, and by 1939, the more profitable one. Measure the town, too, by the people it now holds. 14,000 residents in 1881, 47,000 by 1901. Roughly 147,000 by 1951, the population multiplying tenfold within a single working lifetime. A fishing hamlet grown into one of the largest holiday towns on Earth. Every fresh thousand needs new lodging, new light, new track. The town builds those things faster than most cities of its size ever have to. It never finishes building them. Picture the promenade on an August evening in the 1930s. The tower stands lit end to end against a sea gone the colour of gunmetal, its four legs bright with bulbs strung by men who climb them by hand. Trams slide past every few minutes, headlamps yellow, top decks packed with day trippers still in their good clothes. 3 piers hold their crowds to the railings. Fishing lines, courting couples, brass bands, all competing for the same stretch of dusk. The illuminations burn for miles along the front, a corridor of coloured light laid over a coast that was empty within living memory. Every boarding house from the front to the station is full to the attics, landladies turning custom away by 9 o'clock. Every light bulb, every carriage on every ride, every rented bed is the same wager, placed again, that next summer the trains come just as full. The wager holds for now, and it is about to pay out on a scale nobody on the Golden Mile has yet imagined. Within 15 years, the trains bring not thousands more, but millions. The number arriving in a single year will reach 17 million. Chapter 7. 17 million. By 1949, the number is no longer an estimate. It is a count taken at the turnstiles and the ticket barriers, and the count says 17 million. 17 million visitors in a single year arriving by excursion train, by charabanc, by the first private cars a rationed nation can afford, into a town of piers and towers and illuminated miles built across 3 generations for precisely this arrival. No resort in Britain approaches the figure. Not Southport, not Morecambe, not Scarborough. Blackpool is not one seaside town among several competing for the industrial workers' fortnight. It is the answer the industrial north has stopped debating. There is, for most of these families, nowhere else to go. Behind the front, in the terraces stacked back from the promenade, the boarding house has become a machine for absorbing them. Tens of thousands of beds are stripped and remade across the town every Saturday morning, before the outgoing family's train has cleared the platform at Central Station. A landlady's entire year can turn on 11 days in July, and thousands of households in this one town keep their books that way. The arrangement is not glamorous, and it is not meant to be. Breakfast at 8, a strict departure by 10, a key left under the mat for the next name on the list. This is what the 17 million become once they step off the platform. Not visitors. Occupants, sorted like freight. For a Bolton weaver or a Preston loom tenter, the week itself is not chosen fresh each year. It is inherited, the way a pew is inherited, or a trade. The same week, because the mill closes that week, and no other. The same street, because an uncle took that street before him. The same landlady, because she remembers his mother's name from before the war, and asks after her before he has said a word. Wakes Week has hardened over 3 generations, from custom into structure, a scaffolding laid across the calendar of an entire region. Families do not decide to come to Blackpool each August. They arrive because arriving is what August has always meant. None of this is written down anywhere, but the whole arrangement rests on one condition, and the condition is never spoken aloud. It is this, that these families, given a choice, will keep choosing a beach on the Irish Sea, under a wind that does not stop and a sky that rarely clears, because there is nowhere warmer they can afford to reach instead. Not because Blackpool has won them on its merits, because nothing else has ever been offered to them at a price a mill wage can carry. The tower, the illuminations, the tramway, the 17 million counted at the barriers, none of it rests on preference, it rests on absence. A peak, examined closely, is not evidence of strength. It is a dependency, stretched to its fullest possible extension. It has not yet been tested. The sea itself has never been the argument. It is cold in June and colder by October, the same grey water that fronted an all but empty coast within living memory. No warmer now for the tower, the trams, and the tens of thousands of beds arranged along its edge. What holds 17 million people to this one strip of coastline is not the water. It is the absence of an alternative, and an absence, by its nature, is not a permanent condition. Every landlady's ledger, every ride at the pleasure beach, every mile of the illuminated front assumes otherwise. It is only the condition that happens so far to be true, and then, very quietly in the years just ahead, that stops being true. Chapter 8. The arithmetic changed. It was not the sun that broke Blackpool, exactly, nor the sea, which had always been cold. It was not the will of its landladies, who swept their front steps in 1968 with the same discipline their mothers had shown in 1938. It was the quiet cancellation, by a machine built for an entirely different purpose, of the one fact the town had been constructed to answer. Through the 1960s, the jet aircraft and the cheap package holiday reached the mill towns that had fed Blackpool its crowds for a century. For roughly the same sum a family in Oldham or Bolton once spent on a week of boarding house rain, that family can now buy a week of guaranteed Mediterranean sun in Spain, on a beach where the weather does not require an act of faith. Blackpool had never competed on climate. It had competed on being the only affordable escape a mill worker could reach. This was not a defeat of enterprise, it was the cancellation of a monopoly, and monopolies once cancelled do not return. The second blow arrives from the same direction as the first prosperity. The Lancashire cotton industry that had sent Blackpool its Wakes Weeks crowds mill by mill, town by town, since the 1870s, is itself dying through these same decades. Spindles idled, sheds sold, the weekly wage that had once been converted so reliably into a fortnight by the sea, no longer being earned at all. The Wakes Weeks tradition, built on a factory closing its gates on a fixed date each summer, cannot survive the closing of the factory for good. Blackpool loses its customers, and in the same years, the entire economic mechanism that had manufactured those customers. It had bound its fortune to a single industry 70 years earlier. It now inherits that industry's collapse as though it were its own. What follows is recorded less in newspapers than in property deeds. Boarding houses built for 6-week seasons and full occupancy are subdivided, room by room, into bedsits and houses of multiple occupancy. let not to holidaymakers now but to the poor and the transient, sent north by housing departments in other towns, cheaply and permanently. A resort built to sell one perfect week a year has no design for the other 51, and no design at all for tenants who never leave. By the century's end, Blackpool records the lowest male life expectancy in England, approximately 73.7 years. Within the town itself, men born in its poorest wards die, on average, more than 13.2 years before men born in its richest ones, a gap the width of a single tram line. The figures are not offered as commentary, they are simply what the ledger shows. The visitor count falls with the same lack of drama. From a post-war peak near 17 million a year, the number slides across the 1990s toward 11 million by 1999. A full third of the crowd simply not arriving year after year without any single event to mark the loss. The infrastructure raised for the flood, the guest houses, the illuminated mile, the piers built to hold thousands who no longer come in thousands becomes, in these years, a structure with no second use. Expensive to heat, expensive to maintain, built for an audience that has permanently redirected itself toward an airport departure lounge instead of a railway platform. Blackpool does not vanish. It simply keeps standing at full scale for a version of itself that stopped arriving. And yet, by 1999, most of what made the town legible from the sea is still there. The tower, the three piers, the trams still running along the same front they had opened in 1885. What had changed was not the skyline. It was everything the skyline could no longer support. Chapter 9. What still stands? The tower is still there. Maxwell and Tuke's 500 feet of ironwork, riveted into shape by men who worked at height for wages that no longer buy anything in Blackpool, now carries a different designation. Grade 1 listed, a monument to itself, protected by the same government whose policies emptied the boarding houses beneath it. It opened in 1894 as an advertisement for a town on the way up. It survives as an artifact of one that came down. Nobody riveting it in 1894 built it to be preserved. They built it to be used. Every autumn, the illuminations still go on. The switch-flipping ceremony that began in 1879 as gas lamps along the promenade now runs 6 miles of LED and neon from the North Pier to Squires Gate, and each September a crowd still gathers to watch a minor celebrity press a button that starts it. The bulbs no longer light workers who have a fortnight's wages to spend walking under them. They light coach parties who come for one evening and go home before the tide turns. The lights still work. The reason for the lights does not. The trams still run. The system Blackpool opened in 1885, the oldest surviving first-generation electric street tramway in Britain, still carries passengers up and down the seafront past guest houses with hand-lettered "No Vacancy" signs that mean something closer to permanently closed. The cars are newer than the rails beneath them. The rails are newer than the promise that laid them. The trams do not know any of this. They keep the timetable. They have always kept the timetable. In 1994, the Pleasure Beach opened the big one, 235 feet of steel, the tallest and fastest roller coaster in the world at the time it opened, built on the same strip of sand where the first switchback railway had gone up in 1896. It was a bet in the old currency. That height and speed and a queue around the block could still be sold to a country whose workers no longer arrived by the trainload. It paid off for a while. It did not bring back the trains. The record now is this. Blackpool ranks as the most deprived local authority district in England. It's in awards among the poorest neighbourhoods in the country by any measure the government keeps, and its rate of antidepressant prescribing among the highest recorded anywhere in the nation. Not a resort in decline. A town absorbing the cost of one. The visitors left first. The economy that depended on them left after. The industry that had once needed cheap rooms for a fortnight's holiday now fills those same rooms with people who cannot afford to leave. What remained was the population that had nowhere else to go. The town keeps trying to rebuild the promise. The Winter Gardens, opened in 1875 for concerts and palm courts, now markets itself to conference organisers from Manchester and Leeds. The tramway has been extended, resurfaced, given new stops. The council sells what is left. The heritage, the skyline, the memory of 17 million visitors a year, packaged now for day trippers and stag parties and the occasional documentary crew. It is not reinvention, it is inventory. Stand on the promenade now on a wet evening in October and the whole arrangement is still visible at once. The tower rises 500 feet of Victorian iron against a sky the colour of wet slate, floodlit from below. The illuminations run the length of the front and double themselves in the standing water on the paving, gold and red and blue, switched on for no one in particular. The tide is coming in the way it has come in for 10,000 years, over the black peat sand that gave the town its name before there was a town to name, filling the pools between the breakwaters, erasing the footprints left an hour before. It is the machinery of a promise that people stopped keeping. It is still switched on, it is still lit. It is still waiting for the trains that built the town and then took everyone away. The tide keeps coming in over the dark sand.